Hey everybody, welcome back to Mastering Avantra. Today's topic is installing the Avantra master server and agent on a Red Hat Enterprise Linux server. So let's go ahead and see what that entails. So I'm going to take you through 5 steps. The first step is installing the prerequisites to running a Avantra installation, stuff like the Java runtime environment and your Postgresql. Of course, you can choose our MS SQL as well if you choose. We'll set up the users that are required to run the services and also set up directories where to store the information and the data. Next, we'll configure our PostgreSQL installation, as well as making sure that SE Linux, in this case on Red Hat, is configured correctly to allow all of that to function the way it should function. Then we'll install Avantra and the agents. And then finally, the really important one, make sure that your services come up every time the box is restarted. So if you're doing OS patching or something that requires the box to be restarted, your services know to come up after that restart and you don't have to start them manually. So let's go ahead and get started. So here I am, I'm logged into my Red Hat machine. And just to show you what we're looking at here, I'll just run hostname CTL. And this gives me all of the information about the operating system itself. And you can see here I'm running Red Hat Enterprise Linux 8.4. So nice and easy. The next thing I'm going to do is just make sure that all my Yum repository, so Yum being the utility we're using to install all of our prerequisites, just make sure that it's up to date. So we'll just do an update -y. Now, if you're running this for the first time in a long time, or you're running it after doing a clean, this can take quite a while. So just before I kicked off the recording, I actually ran the update already. It took about 20 minutes, but it made sure that all the repositories were up to date. And that's typically one of the things I do to start with. Next, we're going to install our prerequisites. So we have a few prerequisites. So let's list them out. So sudo yum install -y. So I use the -y flag just so it's not prompting me saying, hey, did you actually want to install this? I know in this case I do, so I'm just going to use the automatic Y. The first package is Postgres. Now that's not the server. That is the tools, Postgresql. That's the tools that allow me to connect to a Postgres server. So it's just useful to have those on the command line. The second one is, you guessed it, Postgresql server, -server. Just like that. So that is the actual server runtime itself. And the next one is purely a personal preference, so feel free to leave this one out. I installed the editor Nano. It's one of my favorite editors over VI or Emacs, and everybody has their favorite. That just happens to be mine. The next one is the Java runtime environment, so 1.8.0, and I'm using the Open JDK, just like that. So that's Java 1.8. And then there's one more that I tend to install, and this is so that I can interact a little bit more elegantly with the secure Enterprise Linux utility, which is built into Red Hat by default, and it's optional on all other Linux distributions. And it's the utility called SE Manage, and this SE Manage allows us to state, hey, the Postgres server is going to be using this folder over here, so let's make sure that that access is allowed. To interact with the SE Linux subsystem, SE Manage is quite a useful utility to do this, and that package is included with that executable is included with the package policy core utils -python -utils. So let me just type that out. So policy core utils -python -utils. Now, if you're running Red Hat Enterprise Linux 7, omit the -utils at the end of this one. So the package name is slightly different in Red Hat 7, but for Red Hat 8, this is it. So what are we installing? We're installing the PostgreSQL tooling. So that's allowing us to connect to a PostgreSQL server. The PostgreSQL server itself. Nano, personal preference, feel free to leave it out. The Java 1.8 OpenJDK runtime environment. And then finally, this is the policy core utils Python scripts. And this brings SE Manage, which is a command that we'll use later on. So I'm going to, no such command install. Might be helpful if I actually used the correct spelling of install. So INSTALL, just like that. So off it goes now. So it has already got the latest information from our Yum repository, so this should actually be fairly quick. And it's picked 62 packages to be installed. As you can see here, this is installing it's validated the names of what I typed. turns out I didn't fat finger them as well as the word install. So the Java 1.8, OpenJDK, Nano, the Policy Core Utils, PostgreSQL, and PostgreSQL Server. Now this is interesting because at Avantra, we support PostgreSQL Server 9.6 up to, I believe it's Postgres 12. By default, you'd obviously like to go for the latest version. At the time of recording, the latest version of PostgreSQL Server is actually 10.18 for the 10 distribution, and it's 11 something and 12 something for the other ones. So I'm actually one behind, and that's because I'm using the standard Yum repositories that came configured with my Red Hat installation. And at the moment, they are providing the latest version of PostgreSQL to be 10.17-1. And I'm okay with that, but it's just something to keep in mind. Perhaps you were looking for PostgreSQL Server that version 12 or 11 or 9.6 or whatever you needed. But it's just bearing in mind that, and any of you who've experience of Linux will know that sometimes the repositories themselves tend to be slightly behind the actual release of the software. You can always, of course, go and download the software, the binaries directly, and set them up for your environment. For the sake of simplicity on this one, I'm not going to do that. So while I've been talking, it's downloaded the 62 packages, and actually it's gone ahead and installed them. So actually, we're completely ready to go for our next steps. And if you want to verify that everything is installed correctly, look, one of the things we installed was Java. So let's do Java-version. And we'll see here that OpenJDK version 1.8.0, patch level 302 is now installed. So we know that our installations worked. Right, so that's the prerequisites done. Let's, just to show you where we are in the whole process here. So we've done our installing the prerequisites. Let's move on now and do the user and directory preparation. So what we're going to do here is we're going to first of all add a user to the operating system, and that user will be responsible for running our Avantra services. So this is not a user that you will ever log into the machine directly with. This is the user that will be responsible for running our services in the background. So we do this using the standard commands. So I'm going to do sudo user add, and I'm just going to call this user Avantra, imaginatively. So I'm going to say the shell for this user is going to be bin bash, because sometimes the default shell is different. And -m means I think it's create the user directory. So once we do that, nice and easy, that's it. We don't specify a password. We don't do any of that kind of stuff because, as I mentioned, this is not an interactive user. We're not going to log on with them. So now I'm going to set up our directory for where we're going to install Avantra. Now, I'm going to install Avantra to the /opt/Avantra directory. Now, typically you would install your runtime files and your executables on a separate volume within your installation. So in this case, my /opt is actually mounted from a different mount point. It's not contained on the core operating system. And so I like to keep all of my runtime files there so that if I need to create a different machine, or if I have swap the data out into a different machine, I'm just detaching and then reattaching that storage volume. So in this case, my /opt is actually set up as a removable volume within my virtual machine setup, so I can transfer between machines or take snapshots or all of that kind of fun stuff. So once we create that directory, now let's just go into that directory and have a look. I'll just go into /opt, let's do an ls-la, and we see here we now have the folder called Avantra, which is owned by the user root, and it's in the group root. Now that's not correct. We want to make sure that this folder is owned by the service user we created earlier. So we do a sudo chown Avantra. Actually, we do a recursive chown, although there's nothing in there, but it's good practice to do it. Avantra as the user, Avantra as the group, and then we'll do /opt/Avantra. So now if we do an ls-la, we'll see that the folder Avantra is owned by the user Avantra and the group Avantra. So that's the first folder we needed to create. The second folder we needed to create is the location of our PostgreSQL data. Now, by default, when you install PostgreSQL Server, it sets up its own data directories and it gets all set up within the core operating system. But again, going back to the way we typically want to set this stuff up, you want your executables for your runtime environment, so Avantra in this case, and your database data to maybe be on removable volumes so you can snapshot them so that you can keep them separate from the underlying OS. So in this case, I'm going to do the same. I'm going to put it on the same volume in /opt. So I'm going to make sudo make directory in opt Postgres, just like that. Let's do Postgresql. And similarly, in the same way that the Avantra directory was owned by root, this one is still owned by root. I'm going to change the owner of that. So sudo chown recursively Postgres and Postgres, which is the standard name of the service user that's set up to run PostgreSQL. And we're going to do opt PostgreSQL like that. Chown minus or, capital or, there we go. Like that. Okay, cool. So now we have our two directories, one for our PostgreSQL data and one for our Avantra data. Next, let's go ahead and set up our PostgreSQL server. Now, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to set up our PostgreSQL server to start automatically when the server starts with some additional configuration items set up. Guess what those configuration items are? They're the location of where we want our database to be stored. So I'm going to use Nano as my text editor. Please feel free to use whatever you would your preferred text editor happens to be. And I'm going to create a file in the systemd system folder, which is where these modules are loaded from. And I'm going to call it postgresql.service. So now it's an empty file, nice and easy. And what I'm going to do first is I'm going to say, okay, include the standard service module for PostgreSQL, and then override these configuration items. How do you include? You do a dot include, you can tell my notes are over here, and it's /lib/systemd, and you can search for this file if it's not at the same path, /system/postgresql.service. Now, bear in mind, we are in /etc/systemd/system/postgresql.service. It's a very similar path, but we are not in the same place, just to be clear. So this is where we are. This is the one we're telling it to include, which is the standard one that's included with a PostgreSQL installation. Next, we're going to adjust the service, and we're going to say environment is equal to pg data is equal to opt postgresql/data. And I do a second one, environment is equal to pglog, and I'll explain what these mean in a moment. PostgreSQL data pg startup.log. Okay, so what these two entries are actually doing are, they are telling the system to set the environmental variable pg data to be this value, and set the environmental variable pglog to be this value. The reason it does that is if you actually open up the PostgreSQL configuration files, you will see that the entries for the pg data, which is the data directory, and the pglog, which is where logs are stored, are actually derived at runtime based on the $, which is the environmental variable pg data and pglog. So all that's happening here is when it's starting the service, it's making sure that it's setting these environmental variables ahead of time. So that's nice and easy. We'll do that. So that's all good to go. The next thing we're going to do is we created the PostgreSQL directory, which we had here. Now we're going to initialize it. PostgreSQL has a number of standard files that you need to put in place in order for a PostgreSQL server to function. And so there's a nice and easy command. So I'm going to do sudo -u because I want to run the command as somebody else. I'm going to run it as the Postgres service user because that owns the directory. And I'm going to say initdb at opt/postgresql/data. So what it's doing now is it's just doing its absolute standard PostgreSQL setup. It's setting up the default database cluster locale, all of that kind of fun stuff at opt PostgreSQL data. Look, this is all standard stuff in PostgreSQL. If you want to find out more about it, please feel free to have a look at the PostgreSQL setup. So now the next thing I'm going to do is I am going to edit one of the newly created files in that directory. So into the PostgreSQL directory, into the data directory, we will now find that there is a file called pg_data It's pg_hba.conf. Yeah, there we go. So the reason the autocomplete wasn't working there is because I actually don't have permissions to read this directory unless I'm the super user. And of course I wasn't at the point where I was running that command. So the file is at opt postgresql data pg_hba.conf, which is the standard client authentication configuration file that comes with every PostgreSQL server. If I just scroll down to the bottom, these are the only entries we're interested in. And these restrict or allow connections from specific locations. I can tell you from experience, I'm going to turn off everything except for the ones that I absolutely want. So local connections are fine, which is what that first line that I've left there is. Local, allow all to all databases, and it's trust-based, which means from within the shells that we're looking at right now, I'm fine with connections. But I also want host-based connections, so network-based connections, allowed to all. And let me just scroll up a little bit so you can see. Here we go. So allow host-based connections to all databases for the user, Avantra DB. From the address, same net is the one I tend to use here, and then MD5 is the authentication method. So allow host-based connections to all databases for the user Avantra DB on the same network using the MD5 authentication method. And you can get more information about this as you go through here. And this basically means that you're restricting so that only the Avantra user can connect to this database. Your own database admins may have different ideas about what they want to set here, and there's more secure ways of doing this. Feel free to have a chat with them and get them to have a look at it. But that at least is that done, and that's our PostgreSQL base configuration complete. So our next thing is we now tell the operating system to, hey, go and reload PostgreSQL. So we'll do this command next, which is system control daemon reload. The reason we call this is because we've actually adjusted the service file up here. So we need system control to go back and realize that there's been a change made. So we run that command first. The next thing we need to do is, I mentioned SE Linux, which is the Secure Enterprise Linux subsystem. If I actually tried to start my PostgreSQL database right now, it would fail. Because that Secure Enterprise Linux subsystem, by default, does not expect PostgreSQL to be trying to use anything in this folder. And so we have a problem because we want PostgreSQL and the service user to be able to access the data in that directory. So we need to tell SE Linux, hey, it's okay. The data in that directory is okay to be used by PostgreSQL and its services. Now, there's a really quite an easy command to do this. So we'll use the SE manage command that we installed earlier that I mentioned. We're going to do the file context. So set the file context, and we're going to add a new type of file context. And there's a standard one, which is PostgreSQL_DB_T, which is PostgreSQL database type. So it's the file context type, and we're adding it to. And now this is where we get to specify where we're adding this to. So opt PostgreSQL, and some people just like to do that, but that doesn't get everything in the directory. And we have to be very specific with SE Linux. So I'm actually going to give a bit of a regular expression here, and I'm going to say, look, everything at that directory, but also then everything inside it. So that dot is all characters, and then the star means any number of all characters. Or 0 or more, I should say. So that means that everything inside in that directory will be applied the context of PostgreSQL database type, and so SE Linux will allow it to pass. You shall not pass. So there we go. So that is now making that change, and it's done. If you want to verify that that change has been made, you can just do this. So ls-la capital Z, and okay, actually I think we need to go into the Postgres folder like this, and then we'll do ls-la-z. There we go. So PostgreSQL, so everything inside in this folder is unconfined. Oh, hold on a second now. Oh, yes, it wouldn't show up yet. So this is actually as things stand right now. So yes, we've told SE Linux that we are just in the file context and this should be allowed for PostgreSQL. But all we've done is say in the future, or by default, this should be allowed. We actually haven't told the SE Linux subsystem to reload the permissions on that directory and to ensure that they're allowed. So let's do that now. And we do sudo restore con, which is to restore the constraints on, we're going to do this recursively. We'll do it in a verbose way on OPT Postgresql. Bum, 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 bum. Because I did -v, we saw that there. Now let me rerun my ls minus laz, and now you see that the data directory in here is an unconfined object, but it also has this type here, which it didn't have earlier, which is going to allow our PostgreSQL server to connect to it. All right, now we're ready to actually enable our PostgreSQL server. So sudo system control enable PostgreSQL. There we go, created the symlink, and then we go sudo system control start PostgreSQL. SQL. There we go. So now our database server is up and running. We're nearly done with the database server, I promise. I know that that part is a little bit complicated, especially with the SE Linux. But the final thing we want to do in our server is we actually want to create the user that Avantra will use to connect with. So just for the sake of easiness, I'm going to go sudo su and Postgres. Just log in as the Postgres user. And now I can use the command line utility PSQL, which is how you connect to PostgreSQL databases. I'm actually going to copy and paste in the commands here just purely because they're a little bit long, but I'll explain them as I paste them in. So here, a user is called a role. So I'm going to create a user Avantra DB with the permissions create DB to log in with the password, this password, and that's just random gibberish that I use for my this demo system. So I do that, and it says, yep, I created a role. And then the second thing we're going to do is we're going to create the database. So I'm calling my database the exact same thing. You can call it whatever you like. You can call it Avantra. In fact, why don't we do that? Let's, the owner will be Avantra database user. Let's call Avantra, just call it Avantra. So create database Avantra owner Avantra DB. Just like that. Cool. And that's it. We're done with the database. So we do a /q. Let's exit out of our super user. And that's it. We're done with this portion. So what's next? Let's figure out where we are. So next we're going to be talking about installing, so we've done the prerequisites. We have done the user and the directory preparation. So that's all done. We've now configured our PostgreSQL server. So that's all good to go. And next we're going to be moving on to actually installing Avantra. So let's go back and do that now. So go back to this one. Okay, so what we need to do now is we're going to go into the Avantra service user that we created earlier, and let's go to our home directory where we're going to be installing Avantra. So do an ls, there's nothing in here. So now we need to download the Avantra installers, and then we're going to install them. Nice and easy. So let's do that. So I'm here on the Avantra download page, which is also at downloads.avantra.com. Very easy to get to. And I'm going to go to components download, and let's start with the server. So we're going to download Avantra server 2011.6, and we're going to look for the Linux bin, which is a Linux binary, get a direct link. I use curl to do this, and helpfully we provide a literally single click copy command, which we just simply paste there like that, and it'll start downloading. The second thing we're going to download, just to help ourselves out, is the agent. So go to the agent, get the latest agent, the direct link on the binary, copy, and we'll paste that over here. Now, some of you might question, why are you downloading the agent? We're not installing the agent right now. One of the things I think you shouldn't overlook is the value of putting the agent onto this server as well, so that you're keeping an eye on the services, on the resources that keep your Avantra system running. Because remember, if the agent is a separate process to the master server itself, even if for some reason your master server was struggling because the CPU was pegged or something along those lines, you still have those statistics from the agent. And so you'll get a different perspective on how your Avantra system is running from your agent. So it's really useful to install both of these on the same box. So now we have our two files installed. So they come by default as not executable. So let's just do chmod plus x on both of these. And we're going to start with the Avantra server. So we just do a // on the bin. Now remember, I already put the Java runtime environment on this machine, and it's on the path. So therefore, the JRE that will be sought during the installation will be found by default. There are also some stuff here where you can add flags and set the Java runtime environment manually and say, hey, listen, use this JRE over here. This is usually more common when you're installing an agent on a box that has an SAP system with a very specific version of Java. You may want to include your own version of Java, not installed globally within the machine, and so that's why we provide that. But in this case, I'm just doing a simple install. So it does all of its verifications of the archive directory, make sure it has a valid Java runtime environment, and then it starts installing. The next question you get asked is, okay, what's the insecure port for connecting to Avantra? The default is 8080. Do you wish to enter a HTTPS port? Yes, I do. I'm going to go with the standard of 8443. And do I want to redirect from HTTP to HTTPS? Yes. In fact, in the future, once all the installation is complete, I kind of recommend completely removing the HTTP port. You don't need it. You'll never use it, or you should never use it. So it's useful to disable that afterwards. So that's the master server done. But I'm going to pause on the master server installation for a second now. Let's do the agent, and then let's do the services startup, and then let's finish the installation of our master server. So just as I did with the master server, I'm now just going to do a // on the agent. And again, it's a very simple install. It'll look for the Java runtime environment. It'll ask us one question, which is, please enter the agent listening port, which by default is 9051, which is perfect. Do I want to start the Avantra agent now? Actually, no, I don't. So I'm just going to say no. That's it. So if I do an ls -la in this directory now, you'll see we have the two executables we just used, but we also now have a folder called agent, a folder called master, and a folder called Zangui. So these are the folders that contain the agent, the master server, and the UI for Avantra. So that's nice and simple to get those installed. Just for the sake of keeping everything nice and clean, I'm just going to remove everything startup bin, and we get a nice clean folder to deal with there. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to make a new directory called services. Now, what's the services folder? Similarly to the way we just use system control to start and stop and to control our Postgresql server, I really highly recommend auto-starting your Avantra services and having them managed by that same system. So if we go back to what we're planning to talk about today, you can see that we've done our installation of Avantra. Now we're going to set up our service auto start. There's a little bit more on the installing of Avantra, which we'll come back to in a few moments. But for now, we're going to set up our services to auto start at system startup. So I've created my directory called /services, and I'm going to create 3 files in here. So I'm going to touch being just create an empty file, Avantra _ master .service, Avantra _ UI .service, and Avantra _ agent .service, like that. And let's just go in and let's edit the master file. Now, here's one I prepared earlier. I'm like a chef. So I'm just going to copy and paste a definition file that I had from earlier, and I'll talk you through it as I'm adjusting it. So I'm just going to make this slight adjustment. So what we have here is we are defining a service unit for our system. As you can see, this one I'm calling the Avantra master service, and it will execute after the network has come up. It is the type forking. There's many different types. There's simple, there's forking, and there's a few others. In this case, the Avantra service does fork and start sub-process and that kind of stuff. So that's why we use the type forking. And then what to do when start is called, what to do when stop is called, and what to do when reload is called. And all I'm doing here is I'm executing opt Avantra master, which is the folder for the master service. And there's a script in there called rc.master. And there's a start, stop, and restart. So that's giving those commands access to this service. So if you call, sudo system control Avantra master or restart Avantra master, it knows how to restart the master. It uses this command. I'm going to run this service as the user Avantra and the group Avantra, and then the install is the default target. So it's a very simple service module that you can define. And once we're done with that, we'll just do that. And now I'm going to do the other two, which are very similar. And I'll show you what they are now. So let's paste in here. And the first thing I'm going to do is just change the title, just so that we don't get duplicates. We're not using the master folder here. We're using the Zangui folder for that's the old name for the Avantra UI. So Zangui and Zangui, and guess what? It's not rc.master. It's Zangui, Zangui, and finally Zangui. Everything else remains the same. So we save, and then let's do the final one, which is Avantra agent.service. Now, I mean, if you were really security conscious and you wanted to keep everything separate, you could, of course, change, for example, these two lines where you have your user and your group defined and have different service users for the different services. So you could have like an Avantra UI service user, an Avantra agent service user, and then start restricting down some of those permissions to really keep them separated and separate from each other. In this case, I'm just using one service user, but feel free to go down that route if you need to. We also have a hardening guide available on our support portal at support.avantra.com, which takes you through some of the follow-on steps you can do to really harden the environment. So there we go. So we now have our 3 services. So they are ready to go. So now what we need to do is we need to enable those services, and then we need to start the services, and then we'll go ahead and we'll finish the configuration of our Avantra system. So I'm going to come out of the user Avantra. So I was logged in as or su'd up to Avantra. I'm now back to myself, and I'm going to use sudo. And the reason I did that, by the way, is because the Avantra user is not in the sudoers group. I did not give it any extra permissions that it doesn't need. So therefore, to do what I'm about to do, which is to enable these services, I need to have the capability to sudo. So we'll do system control, and we're going to do enable opt Avantra services Avantra master.service. Done. So that was Avantra master. Let's do Avantra UI.service. Done. And then finally, let's do Avantra agent.service. And then finally, so we've enabled those services. So if we restarted the machine, they would come up the next time, but let's go ahead and just start them now. So start Avantra master. And this is one of the nice ways of doing it this way, and it's quite elegant. You get to reference Avantra and its subservices by their name. So we're saying system control, start the Avantra master server. System control, start the UI server, Avantra UI server. And then finally, system control, start the Avantra agent. And we get to see these services as their own individual services in their own right, within all the logs and all that kind of fun stuff. So that's the configuration of our Avantra installation to ensure that it starts up at runtime. But let's go ahead now and get everything up and running. So let's get, I'm just going to grab the IP address of this machine. So there it is, 10.103.15.33. I'm going to pop over here, 8443. Let's see if it's up yet. It may not be up yet. It might still be starting based on those services that I had running. Let's just give it a minute. Okay, I'm back. I did pause for a second, full disclosure. Turns out on my machine, on my virtual machine, I had not configured the firewall to allow access on 8443, so I was hitting a nice little blocked wall. But as soon as I added that firewall rule, immediately you can see here that I got this nice yellow border. Thank you, Mozilla Firefox, great browser. And it's telling me, look, it's a self-signed cert, but we knew that. So we're going to accept the risk and continue. And it's going to bring us to the Avantra web UI in order to do our initial setup. So this is the wizard we take you through to allow you to provide the credentials to Avantra for connecting to the database, but also allow you then to specify the root username and password and all of that kind of fun stuff. So let's go ahead and get started. So we're going to use a Postgresql server. It's going to be on localhost. That's fine. The username is AvantraDB, and I'm going to paste in the password. And now, if you remember earlier, so by default we suggest a database name, XANDRIA, which is the name of the original Avantra software. You'll see if I hit the drop down, I get two other options, Avantra and Postgres. If you remember earlier when we were logged into the Postgresql server, I created a database and made the owner the Avantra DB user. So that's the database I'm going to choose to use. You can create one if you so wish as well. We hit next and it says, yeah, I'm good, I can connect. It all seems to be working. So we'll do a create and verify the schema. So it creates the tables, it populates them with some base data, and then just does some verification checks to make sure like your locale is set up correctly, your all of that kind of fun stuff is set correctly. So create a database Avantra, press next to proceed. So now we have this, and it says, okay, now it's time to define your root username and password. At this point, I suggest you make this a very long and complex password, and then save the password somewhere, but don't really use it that often, because you're going to want to create your own user and have this as the kind of the fallback major user that looks after stuff like upgrades or if there's something wrong with your identity providers or something along those lines. So I'm going to set that up and say save and sign in. So what it's doing now is it's saving that information. It's checking out the database, making sure everything is connecting the way it should. It is saving the configuration we've just put in. And guess what? Our Avantra system is now up and running. If I go root and sign in, there you are. We're now signed into our Avantra 20.11.6 system on Red Hat Enterprise Linux. As you can see here, there's stuff that's not running yet because it's not fully set up, but also we've yet to install our license. So that will be the next step that we follow on through. And there's more Mastering Avantra videos that cover those topics if you're interested. So what did we do today? So we did a complete installation of Avantra end-to-end on a Red Hat Enterprise Linux 8 machine. Same steps for 7, apart from that one slight adjustment to the installation command. We did the installation prerequisites, which were Postgresql tools, Postgresql server, Java runtime environment, and those SE Linux helper tools, SE Manage, which is the name of that tool. We set up our service user for Avantra itself, so that's the Avantra service user, and then we did directory setup for the Avantra installer files and the Postgresql data, and we did those on a separate volume that had already been mounted to the operating system. We configured our Postgresql server, and remember we changed that configuration to point to that removable directory so that we were storing our database information on that separate volume. And we also adjusted SE Linux's rules to allow access to that directory to ensure that Postgresql could read the data in there. We then went ahead and installed Avantra, downloaded the installers from downloads.avantra.com, ran them, set everything up, and then we moved to adding those services as auto-starting services using the system control feature within Red Hat, and there's similar versions in all versions of Linux. And then finally, we went to the browser and we went through the wizard to set up Avantra, set up the database, and get ourselves ready to start using the system in anger. So there we go. I hope that was a useful end-to-end walkthrough of Red Hat setup for Avantra. Please give us feedback if there's something we missed or if you encounter something different. It's always useful to hear what kind of challenges people encounter or whether this was useful or not. So thanks very much for watching, and we'll see you next time.